In 1980, three brothers, Elliott, Malcolm, and Griffin Hayes, vanished from New York City without a trace. For 45 years, the case lay cold, until a Brooklyn couple renovating their brownstone found a sealed steel trunk behind a wall. Inside were childhood relics that reignited a conspiracy spanning decades, revealing secrets that could shatter everything their grieving mother believed. Into cinematic true crime, whether it's haunting fiction or real-life disappearances finally cracked. Subscribe now and tap the bell. Missing Shadows brings the darkest mysteries to light. The summer heat clung to Brooklyn like a damp cloth, pressing against the old brownstones in a way that made even the air feel heavy. Mason Turner wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, the taste of drywall dust on his tongue. The renovation had been going smoothly, until his crowbar struck something that didn't sound like wood or brick. Clang. The metallic echo reverberated through the narrow hallway, stopping both him and Claire in their tracks. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby, sorting through old paint cans, but now she looked up sharply. "What was that?" she asked. Mason tilted his head, tapping the wall again. The sound was dull but hollow in places, and then another clang. He stepped back, exchanged a glance with Claire, and began peeling away chunks of plaster. Layers of paint and decades-old wallpaper fell like dead leaves, revealing something dark and flat underneath. "Is that metal?" Claire stood, brushing dust off her jeans. Together they worked in silence, the room filling with the smell of pulverized plaster. Finally, the outline of a large steel trunk emerged, wedged into a recess that had been bricked over long ago. Rust pitted its surface, and a thin line of corrosion streaked the wall beneath it like dry tears. Mason tested the lid, but it wouldn't budge. He retrieved a pry bar from his toolbox, wedged it under the latch, and heaved. The trunk groaned before surrendering with a metallic pop. Inside, layers of yellowed fabric and newspaper clippings cradled a handful of objects: a worn baseball glove, 3 matchbox cars, a set of jacks, and a Polaroid photograph. Claire picked it up carefully. The image had faded, but the joy in it was still alive. 3 young boys, grass-stained knees, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at something just outside the frame. "They're triplets," she whispered, her voice almost reverent. Mason was about to answer when the front door creaked open and the contractor called out from downstairs, "You guys okay up there?" But Claire didn't respond. She was staring at the photo like it had reached through time to grab her. And miles away, in a small rent-controlled apartment, a woman in her 70s sat watching the local evening news. When the Polaroid appeared on the screen, her teacup slipped from her hands, shattering against the floor. By the next morning, the Turners' quiet renovation had turned into a neighborhood spectacle. A Channel 7 News van idled at the curb, its antenna jutting skyward. Neighbors leaned on stoops, murmuring over paper coffee cups, their eyes darting toward the brownstone. Claire hadn't planned to talk to reporters, but when a young field journalist mentioned a possible cold case from 1980, her instincts took over. She kept her voice measured, careful not to speculate, but she did hold up the Polaroid for the camera. Within hours, the image had made its way across local TV online blogs, and even the NYPD's official missing persons Twitter feed. 2 subway stops away, Frank Delgado was slouched in the corner booth of a diner, working through his second cup of black coffee. His joints ached the way they always did in August, and he'd stopped pretending it was anything other than age. He wasn't looking at the TV over the counter until he heard the anchor say, "A photograph believed to be connected to the disappearance of 3 Brooklyn brothers in 1980. Frank's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He knew that photograph. He'd seen it on Eleanor Hayes' kitchen table 45 years ago, the morning after the triplets vanished. His stomach sank. He tossed a 20 on the counter and left without finishing breakfast. Eleanor Hayes had been reading on her small balcony when her neighbor banged on the door. She'd grown used to ignoring knocks. Most were for building maintenance or packages. But this time, the neighbor wouldn't leave. "Eleanor, you should see this," the woman said breathlessly, pointing toward her TV. The photo filled the screen, framed by the headline, "Possible Break in 1980 Missing Children Case." Eleanor's knees wobbled. She gripped the arm of her chair, feeling the room tilt. The sight of her boys, 8 years old, alive in that captured moment, hit her like a tidal wave. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. She whispered each name as if they were in front of her. Elliott, Malcolm, Griffin. That night, as the city hummed with heat and the low rattle of air conditioners, Frank Delgado stood outside Eleanor's apartment building, the photo printed in his hand. He hadn't spoken to her in decades. When she opened the door, her expression was guarded, but when her gaze dropped to the Polaroid, her breath caught. "They found it," Frank said quietly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the image. "No," she murmured. "They found something." It had been one of those golden summer afternoons in New York City, when the air felt electric with possibility. Kids darted between fire hydrants spraying arcs of water, the streets echoing with the sound of stickball games and transistor radios. Elliott, Malcolm, and Griffin Hayes tore down the block, laughing so hard they had to clutch their sides. Elliott led the way, his red Matchbox car clutched in one hand like a talisman. Malcolm trailed just behind, his compass necklace bouncing against his chest. Griffin lagged a few steps, a baseball glove swinging from his fingers. They weren't supposed to be this far from home, but the promise of finding the perfect spot had carried them past familiar corners, toward the shadowy mouth of the subway entrance on 7th Avenue. "Race you to the pigeons," Griffin shouted, pointing at the flock pecking at crumbs by the stairs. Malcolm hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder toward home. "We're going to be late for dinner," he warned. Elliott grinned, the kind of grin that made following him irresistible. "Just 5 more minutes." The boys darted toward the pigeons, sending feathers and wings exploding into the air. A man leaning against the railing chuckled, tossing crumbs toward the scattering birds. He looked vaguely familiar to them, one of those neighborhood faces you'd seen a dozen times but couldn't quite place. The man tipped his cap. "You boys like baseball?" he asked. Griffin's face lit up instantly. "Got something to show you," the man continued, his voice casual, almost friendly. Elliott's grin faltered, but the man's tone was warm enough to quiet suspicion. He beckoned them toward the side of the station, where the shadows were longer. A passing bus roared by, drowning out Malcolm's voice as he said something to his brothers. By the time the sound faded, the boys were gone from sight. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw Elliott, Malcolm, and Griffin Hayes alive. The moment Eleanor realized her boys weren't home for dinner, the summer light still lingering outside, she felt a coldness seep into her bones. It wasn't the kind of lateness that could be explained away by a game or a friend's house. Something was wrong. She called out their names on the block, checked the corner store, the playground, even the stoop of their best friend's building. No one had seen them since late afternoon. By nightfall, the streetlights hummed to life, casting pale halos on the cracked sidewalks. Eleanor stood on her stoop, scanning the shadows, her fingers trembling as she dialed the police. Underscore 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 underscore. Detective Frank Delgado was only 5 years into the job when he arrived at the Hayes apartment that night. The air inside was thick, part heat, part fear. Eleanor clutched a dish towel in one hand, twisting it until the fabric strained. "They wouldn't just run off," she insisted, her voice breaking. Frank took her statement carefully, jotting every detail. The triplets had been last seen near 7th Avenue, no known conflicts, no behavioral issues. The father, Robert Hayes, had been at work at the docks until 6. The first 48 hours were chaos. Flyers with the boys' faces went up on lampposts and bodega windows. Police combed subway stations, vacant lots, and rooftops. Volunteers fanned out across the neighborhood, calling the boys' names into the summer night. But every lead fizzled. A shop owner said he'd seen them talking to a man in a cap near the subway entrance, but couldn't recall his face clearly. A transit worker reported 3 kids matching their description entering the station, but there was no camera footage in 1980 and no ticket records worth anything. Then came the whispers. Some said it was gang-related, that the boys had stumbled into something they shouldn't have seen. Others muttered about Robert Hayes' debts, that maybe the wrong people had come calling. Eleanor refused to believe any of it, but the rumors spread like smoke, impossible to pin down. By the end of the month, the posters were sun-bleached and curling at the edges. Detectives rotated to new cases. The Hayes case slipped from the headlines. For Eleanor, time stopped on that summer evening in 1980 and never started again. The weeks after the disappearance bled into months, each one grinding Eleanor further into a quiet kind of despair. At first, she clung to action, attending every search, calling precincts daily, showing the boy's photo to anyone who would meet her eyes. But as the calls stopped being returned and the flyers began to sag with rainwater, a numbness settled in. She kept their bedroom exactly as it had been on the last morning she saw them. 3 twin beds lined the far wall, each with its own quilt. The Matchbox cars stayed on Elliott's windowsill, the compass necklace in Malcolm's desk drawer, the baseball glove on Griffin's pillow. Every Saturday, Eleanor dusted the room as if the boys might burst through the door at any moment, tracking in dirt from the street. Robert Hayes dealt with the grief differently, by burying it under long hours at the docks and whiskey at night. At first, Eleanor understood. Everyone copes in their own way. But as the years passed, the distance between them grew into something sharp and unspoken. Conversations became short, functional, almost entirely about bills or repairs. By their 15th wedding anniversary, they were living separate lives under the same roof. 2 years later, Robert packed a single duffel bag and left. Eleanor didn't follow him to the door. Every so often, a phone call would reignite a flicker of hope. A sighting in Queens, a child in a hospital who couldn't remember his name. But each time, the lead collapsed under the weight of facts. None of them were her boys. Frank Delgado, too, carried the case like an old injury. Even after moving on to other investigations, he kept a manila folder marked Hayes, 1980, in his filing cabinet at home. He'd open it on restless nights, running a finger over the Polaroid copy, haunted by the feeling he'd missed something obvious. By the time the 20th anniversary passed, Eleanor had stopped expecting a knock at the door, but she still kept her phone by her bed, just in case, she would tell herself. She didn't realize it yet, but that call, 45 years in the making, had already begun to move toward her. The steel trunk had been sitting in the Turners' living room for 2 days, its contents carefully bagged and tagged by the NYPD. But there was one thing Claire couldn't shake. When she'd first lifted the baseball glove, she'd felt an odd vibration in the trunk's bottom, like it wasn't solid. That night, after the police had left and Mason had gone upstairs, Claire crouched beside it with a flashlight. She ran her fingers along the seams. One edge gave a faint metallic click. Her pulse quickened. She pried at the corner until a thin panel lifted free. Dust swirled up like smoke, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell, old paper and mildew. Inside the hidden compartment lay a single envelope, edges warped from moisture. Across the front, in blocky, smudged handwriting, were the words, "Don't trust him. He knows where they are." The rest of the page inside was nearly illegible, the ink blurred into ghostly lines. A few phrases stood out. Subway, 7th Avenue, basement door. Claire didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she took the envelope straight to Detective Frank Delgado, who now wore the weary lines of retirement, but still moved like a man with unfinished business. He studied the note for a long moment before speaking. "This wasn't in our evidence back then," he said quietly. "Someone hid this on purpose. And the him. I have an idea who that might be." Claire leaned in. "Who?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He slipped the note into a plastic sleeve, his jaw tightening. "Before I say anything," he told her, "we need to talk to someone who's been keeping his mouth shut for 45 years. Frank Delgado had been retired for nearly a decade, but the moment he held that letter, the job was back in his bones. He called in an old favor with a contact still inside the department, convincing them to temporarily reopen the Hayes file under newly discovered evidence. By the end of the week, Frank, Claire, and Mason were sitting at a small table in the corner of a Brooklyn coffee shop. Spread out between them were copies of maps from 1980, faded newspaper clippings, and Frank's original case notes, the pages yellow and brittle at the edges. "This is where they were last seen," Frank said, tapping a spot on the map, 7th Avenue subway entrance. It's also 2 blocks from a service tunnel that was sealed off in the early 80s. Claire leaned over the map. "And you think this letter is telling us to check that tunnel?" "I think it's telling us someone used that tunnel," Frank replied. "And that him, I have a strong suspicion it was a man named Albert Finch." Albert Finch had been a neighborhood handyman in 1980. He fixed boilers, patched roofs, and spent most of his afternoons hanging around corner stores. Finch also had a minor record, petty theft, breaking and entering, but nothing violent. He'd disappeared from Brooklyn within weeks of the Triplets vanishing. "Problem is," Frank said, "Finch isn't in any police database after 81. He's a ghost." Their first stop wasn't Finch himself, but someone who might have known him, Walter Price, now 82, who had lived in the same brownstone since the 60s. Walter answered the door in a worn bathrobe, peering suspiciously at the trio. "We're asking about the summer of 1980, Frank began, showing his old badge. "The Hayes Triplets." Walter's eyes flickered, not surprise exactly, but recognition. He scratched at the stubble on his chin. "I saw those boys," he said slowly. They disappeared. They were with Finch. He had a baseball in his hand, was talking real nice to, Frank's jaw clenched. "Why didn't you tell us that back then?" Walter looked away. "Because, Finch, he worked for people. People you didn't cross in those days." Walter shuffled to his worn armchair, settling in as if preparing to relive a long-buried secret. His eyes narrowed, voice gravelly but steady. That summer, the city was buzzing with talk about the old warehouses on 7th Avenue. Big money was trying to buy them up, tear them down, make way for fancy apartments. But not everyone wanted that. Finch, he was a runner for the people who wanted to keep those buildings off the market. Claire leaned forward. "What kind of people?" Walter glanced around like he feared the walls might listen. "Mobsters mostly. Real estate sharks with muscle." Finch did their dirty work, watching, warning, sometimes handling trouble. He paused, then sighed. Those boys got mixed up in something bigger than they could understand. Finch brought M to one of those warehouses the day they vanished. Frank's eyes darkened. "Did you see what happened?" Walter shook his head. "No, but I know Finch never came back around here after that week." Claire felt a chill creep up her spine. The letter's warning suddenly made sense. Not just a cryptic note, but a glimpse into a world Eleanor Hayes never knew existed. The city buried this, just like they buried those buildings, Walter said bitterly. But some of us remember. The deeper Frank, Claire, and Mason dug, the clearer it became. The Hayes boys had been caught in the crossfire of a ruthless real estate war. The dilapidated warehouses Finch once guarded weren't just abandoned buildings. They were pawns in a silent, brutal game. Old city records revealed a trail of shady land deals, front companies, and untraceable cash flows. Several influential figures had quietly pressured long-time residents to sell or disappear. Frank's voice was low but grim as he reviewed the documents. This wasn't just about buildings. It was about power. Whoever controlled the land controlled the future. Claire nodded, her journalistic instincts blazing. And the boys? They saw too much, or maybe just the wrong people. Mason clenched his fists. So Finch was protecting these people, keeping secrets, and the boys got silenced? Frank sighed. That's the most likely explanation. But we need proof. It was Claire who found her, a frail woman living under a different name in a quiet Queens apartment. She answered the door cautiously, eyes wary but haunted. I was scared, she admitted after some coaxing, her voice trembling. I saw the boys that night. Finch brought them to that warehouse, but I didn't know what would happen next. She told them about the shadows in the building, voices hushed, hurried footsteps, and the feeling that crossing the wrong people meant disappearing without a trace. I never wanted to get involved, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. But the silence has been worse. Her testimony gave Frank and Claire new leads, names whispered in fear, locations erased from public maps, and a network of complicity that reached far beyond what anyone had imagined. The investigation was no longer just dusty files and fading memories. Late one evening, as Claire was poring over old newspaper clippings, a sharp knock rattled her apartment door. A plain white envelope slid under the crack with a chilling message scrawled inside. "Stop digging. Some stones are better left unturned." Mason's phone buzzed too. Unknown number. A voice distorted beyond recognition warned them to drop the case. Instead of backing down, their resolve hardened. They knew the risks. But after 45 years, Eleanor Hayes deserved the truth. The abandoned warehouse loomed under a sky heavy with clouds, its cracked windows like watching eyes. Frank, Mason, and Claire pushed through rusted doors, flashlights cutting swaths through decades of dust and silence. Behind a crumbling wall, they found a narrow cellar hatch, half buried in rubble. Hearts pounding, they pried it open to reveal a cramped space. Inside lay 3 small skeletons, each clutching a pendant, a red matchbox car charm, a compass necklace, and a worn baseball glove. Frank swallowed hard. They never left. Back at Eleanor's apartment, Frank showed her the evidence. Tears traced lines down her weathered face as she whispered the names she had held close for so long. "They're finally home," she said, voice breaking but peaceful. Eleanor stood quietly in the small cemetery, 3 fresh headstones gleaming beneath a soft drizzle. Family, neighbors, and a few of the city's officials gathered to honor the Hayes triplets, long lost, finally found. Frank watched Eleanor from a distance, feeling the weight of decades lift just a little. The city's tangled past had been exposed, and the truth, though painful, was no longer buried. Claire's article on the case went viral, sparking conversations about forgotten victims, unchecked power, and the cost of silence. Mason kept working on his brownstone, now a symbol of hope amid old wounds. Eleanor folded the letter found in the trunk one last time, slipping it into her coat pocket. "Rest easy, my boys," she whispered. And somewhere deep beneath Brooklyn, the echoes of their laughter finally found peace. If this story left you speechless, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe for more true, haunting mysteries like this one.